Hello, my name is Soo Jung-go. I start the presentation. This study attempts to understand the tangible characteristics of the space between space and space. In addition, I would like to propose some architecture planning elements that can activate the gap space into a space with a new value according to the tangible characteristics. To this end, this study examines the concepts and characteristics of boundaries and gaps between space and space, and embodies the tangible characteristics of the gap space as a spatial concept. Based on this, an architecture planning element was proposed as an alternative that can activate the space in the gaps found in the research target site into a space with a new value according to its tangible characteristics. The building planning elements proposed in this study are summarized as follows. First, the space between the large and small spaces empties the existing space and expands it into frames to segment the space. Various cultural programs can be blended in this expanded space to expand into a space for spatial and functional communication. Second, the space of the gap generated by the overlapping roof expands the meaning of the gaps as an empty space by using a wire frame connected together with the existing structure. Third, the gap between the building existing in the target site and the adjacent space between the building is blended as a place to expand the spatial meaning so that it can play a role as a passage connecting the inside of the target site and the city. Space is basically formed by interrelationship between an object and humans who perceive it, and human attitudes towards space can psychologically reflect their visual world. In other words, the subjective world of space can change at any time depending on individual emotions and psychological status, and the meaning of space reflects individual psychological attitudes and emotions. There is a gap in space where boundaries are formed between spaces of different meanings, and the properties of the boundary are revealed. Space gap can be interpreted in various meanings in addition to spatial, temporal, and abstract concepts, and different in ideas and perceptions arise due to individual psychological and mental influences. Therefore, the gap is formed into a frame of perception as an intrinsic imaging space through psychological interaction through the internal and external sides of an individual and relationship with others. Over time, cities have grown rapidly in recent years, and the spaces that are being disconnected in the process of developing cities have gradually emerged, and the gaps between past spaces and development have arisen. In this study, attention is paid to temporal and spatial gaps in urban spaces that occur with the development of cities. In particular, I would like to propose some architecture planning elements that can activate the space of the gap into a space of new value according to these tangible characteristics by grasping and tangible characteristic of the space between space and space. Study aims to propose an architecture planning elements that can activate the space between space and space into a space with new value according to tangible characteristics. The contents of the study for this are as follows. First, the concept and characteristics of boundaries and gaps between space and space are considered. Second, the tangible characteristics of the space in the gap are embodied as a concept of space. Third, we propose an architecture planning elements that can activate the gap space into a space with new value according to tangible characteristics. Boundaries refer to ambiguous areas in which coexisting and opposing worlds, cosmos and chaos, daily and non-daily life, center and surroundings, achievements, is processes, purely affairs act overlap each other. In other words, boundary refer to the physical and psychical domain shared by two opposing worlds. Due to the nature of these ambiguous boundaries, even similar spatial organizations can be recognized as spaces with different characteristics depending on the specific appearance of the boundary limiting space. Therefore, the boundary is not a point where a certain shape ends, but a starting point that starts for existence. As such, boundaries appear in almost all environments surrounding us, from individual small spaces to natural areas as a device for separating a particular area from other areas. Boundary is the point where something ends, but it is also the starting point of the other, and when these boundaries form an independent area, it becomes a boundary space. The formation begins in this boundary space, and exchanges and communication between unlikely things occur, creating an identity of a new boundary. A new spatial area is formed by the boundary space, and a new place of experience is created. The gap is a small space and exists at the boundary. It can exist anywhere where space changes its character or on the border where different spaces meet. The gap contains two-side spatiality as the boundary passes between different spaces. The dictionary meaning of the gap is defined as split and separated place inside the people who are gathered. When the worlds of the two domains A and B are separated, there is a spatial gap between them. This gap is the boundary area as in the spatial sense. In this way, the two worlds are separated by a distance that is not directly affected, and at the same time, a gap as a boundary space can be found in the relationship with each other. In this case, the gap is a space that encompasses all boundaries and serves as an intervention, not a disconnection of space. In this way, the gap is an important space element for each space to maintain its independence. A gap forms a small area of space and acts as a key element in the area composition process while separating and mediating one area from another. Due to gaps, different species can no longer maintain a simple and fixed relationship, but a complex and fluid relationship, and the relationship between species appears to be an uncertain phenomenon that constantly affects, gradually transforms, and changes. As such, gaps between different species overlap each other beyond the fixed frame of the space, forming a new space of the concept expanded by these overlapping gaps. Table 1 summarizes the type of gaps between different species. The difference in the clear size of the two overlapping species creativity, a space recognized as a single gap, such as slabs and slabs, walls and walls. In nonlinear matricica, the space between the three gaps caused by the difference in the size of the space was planned as a terrace, pilotis, and staircase space, respectively. As such, spaces with relatively narrow gaps form a completely space and also show the possibility of developing into various species as independent species. The word pulls and penetrates to form a space for gaps through inclination. Through this, an empty space is formed, and this empty space becomes a central space and organically forms a program. As a result, each space was woven around an empty space and a gap and blended as a single space. The park was formed by filling artificial waterfalls, ivy, trees, tables, and chairs in the small land, a space between buildings. The space between the building and the building has a strong negative concept as an abandoned idle space, but Paley Park transformed the space between the buildings into a space of nature, relaxation, and communication. It shows the concept of expanding gaps in which cramped spaces between buildings expand and connect to the city textile and Jeonnam Textile located in 60 Seorimdo, Imdong, Bukgu, Gwangju are factory sites that have started operating since 2017. The 100,000 site houses huge industrial facilities ranging from dormitories, private houses, childcare and educational facilities, and medical facilities. With urban development, this place was cut off from the city like an island, making it a space of the past with only traces. In this study, we would like to propose an applicable architecture planning element according to the tangible characteristics of the space between gaps that can be found here, so that this place can be activated as a space with new value. One of the type of gaps caused by overlapping spaces found in the target site is a space created by overlapping a large type of factory mass and a smaller factory mass, which is a space between the other wall and the inner wall, such as a corridor and corridor. The space type can be found on the roof of the factory remaining in the target site, where the roof overlap each other to form a gap space between the overlapping loops. Finally, there is a gap in an adjacent space formed in the space between the building and the building. The space between the large and small spaces can be segmented by emptying the existing space and expanding it into frames. The space between these extended gaps is a passage through on boundaries and a space of freedom that can be moved. This acts as a space for intervention, not disconnection between the outside and the inside. The empty space of the gap expands vertically, and the wall of the factory, which was cut off, serves as an open space using frames. Various cultural programs are blended in this expanded space and expanded into space for spatial and functional communication. The space of the gap generated by the overlapping roof as a second type of gap may be expanded using a wireframe. The space of the expanded gap using the wireframe is connected with the existing structure to expand the meaning of the gap as an empty space. The formation of the new relationship between the inner space and the outer space is an architecture device that positively affects the environment of the inner space where there was no light and emphasized the spatial meaning of the existing gap. The gap between the building and the building adjacent to the target site can be blended as a place to expand the spatial meaning of the gap, and the movement path is blended around the empty spaces and trace of the path, which plays a role in connecting the target site and the city. This study aims to propose an architectural planning element that can activate the space between space and space into a space with a new value according to tangible characteristics. The type of gaps found in the study target sites in this study are organized into gaps caused by overlapping spaces, gaps in overlapping loops, and gaps in spaces between buildings. The building planning elements proposed in this study are as follows. First, the space between the large and the small spaces empties the existing space and expands it into frames to segment the space. Various cultural programs can be blended in this expanded space to expand into a space for spatial and functional communication. Second, the space of the gap generated by the overlapping roof expands the meaning of the gap as an empty space by using a wire frame connected together with the existing structure. Third, the gap between the building existing in the target site and the adjacent space between the building is blended as a place to expand the spatial meaning so that It can play a role as a passage connecting the inside of the target site and the city. This study is meaningful in that it pays attention to the space between gaps that have been isolated in the process of rapid growth and development and suggests an alternative that can activate it as a space of new value. That is for the presentation. Thank you for your attention.